Good afternoon, everyone. This is John Shaw, the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. Thanks for joining another installment of our series, Understanding Our New World. And we're really delighted today to be joined by Ellen Alberding, who is the CEO and president of the Joyce Foundation, which is a really important foundation, both nationally and in the region. It's based in Chicago, but has a particularly strong focus in the Great Lakes region. We'll talk about that. Ellen has a really interesting background. She grew up outside of New York City, attended Brown University, where she studied English. Then she moved to Chicago and went to Kellogg, got an MBA at Northwestern, focusing on finance and marketing. Briefly entered the corporate world, but then found her way in the nonprofit sector. She's been at Joyce since 1989. Joyce, as I said, is doing some really remarkable things. It's a powerful institution, about $1.3 billion in assets. I think it distributes around 50 million each year in programs, doing a lot of really innovative work. And so we're interested to find out what it has done so far and then where it is headed in the future. So Ellen is joining us from Chicago area. So good afternoon, Ellen.
Hello, and thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Great, thank you. Well, Ellen, you grew up outside of New York City, and as I read your biography, I read that your parents were really civically minded, very active. I think they actually had become quite interested in the work of Dorothy Day, who was a real social justice and workers' rights pioneer. Talk a little bit about your parents and the influence they had in kind of shaping your view of the world.
Yeah, well, I think everybody is shaped one way or another by their early experiences as young people. And in my case, I did have very socially active parents. They were, among other things, very engaged in, this was the 1960s, early 1970s, and they were very engaged in sort of the Catholic activist community, which was a big thing then. I mean, it's still important, but the Berrigan brothers and other activists who were involved in social justice issues. And because of that exposure, which my parents took very seriously, took all of the kids to peace marches and various things. I learned really early on the importance of activism and civic engagement. And in addition, my father, we had an elected school board, and he ran for school board and was elected, and then became president of the school board right into the big teacher strikes of the early 1970s that were kind of the forefront of advocacy and activism on the union side of things. So I saw both sides of that set of issues as a kid as well. So a lot of cross currents. It wasn't an easy time to be an adolescent. And, there are a lot of forces at work in one's life, but fortunately mine were positively directed.
Great. And then you studied English at Brown, and then you went on for an MBA. Tell us a little bit about that. Was it like, okay, I'm going to study what really kind of excites me intellectually? And was the MBA with more of a stance towards professional development, or how did those unfold?
Yeah, well, it was not like an inevitable planned life at that time. But first of all, I did take a detour into community college. When I was in high school, I went to the local community college, Rockland Community College, and which prepared me a little bit more for college life. When I got to Brown, which was incredibly fortunate for me that I was able to go there, I just was a literature person, and it's what I had no idea about what I might do professionally, and really never gave it a thought, which is very irresponsible. But I loved English literature, and that's what I focused on. I wrote my honors thesis on T.S. Eliot, not sure what that did for me professionally, but I had a lot of fun doing it. The MBA, yeah, that was more of a I needed the skills. I just wanted the quantitative background because I thought it would be useful to me. And I was working full time and went at night. So it took me, 3 years to get a 2-year degree, but I got there.
And talk about your first job or jobs were in the corporate sector, is that right? And then kind of moving into the nonprofit world, how that happened.
Yeah. Well, my first job was in the corporate world, and it didn't. It just wasn't the right fit for me. And so when I left that, I actually went into campaigns and politics, and I worked on the Adlai Stevenson campaign in 1982. And I always advise young people who are saying, I don't know what to do. Where should I start? And I'm like, campaigns are a great place to learn a lot. You learn a lot about people. You make a lot of relationships. And in my case, I met my husband on the campaign, but I also met particularly a set of really high-powered women, most of whom were volunteering, who were, a generation ahead of me or half a generation ahead of me. And that set of women has been an incredible resource for me of friendship and guidance and professional advice all these years later. So that was a great experience. And then I moved into the nonprofit world. I worked on in a prison reform organization called the John Howard Association. And then from that, worked at a museum. And then from that went into philanthropy. So, careers aren't, some people really plan things out, and some people, you just keep moving around and finding the right fit. And for me, things worked out well.
Well, let's talk about Joyce. And on your website, you have it's a wonderful video, the history of Joyce, which I found really interesting. But also you have a really succinct mission statement. And I know that, mission statements have to be concise, but let me just kind of summarize yours and then have you kind of expand. You say, the Joyce Foundation is a private, nonpartisan philanthropy that invests in public policies and strategies to advance racial equity and economic mobility for the next generation in the Great Lakes region. Build off of that.
Well, the mission of the foundation and the focus of the foundation, which is driven by our board, has always been on addressing the issues of low-income and disenfranchised people. And that's a very broad could be potentially a very broad set of issues and things to focus on. And what we try to do within that is define it more narrowly on policy and things that we think we can have an impact on. And the being explicit about racial equity is, it's always been part of our mission, but we felt when we revised our mission statement that it wasn't clear enough that racial equity is absolutely essential to addressing the issues of the disenfranchised and low-income people in our region. So we've raised the language up. It hasn't changed our actions, because our actions have always been focused on equity and racial equity.
Well, and then Joyce began, maybe to just back up a little bit, in 1948 by a donation from Beatrice Joyce Keene. It was maybe a $2,000 donation that she gave, and kind of trace the evolution from there. I mean, what was it? Fairly steady growth, or were there some periods of just kind of explosive growth? I mean, in brief, what was sort of the evolution from 1948 on?
Yeah. Well, Beatrice Joyce Keene was the only child of a wealthy couple, and they had investments in oil and gas and timber and other natural resources. She actually ran the company for a while, but unfortunately, when she died young, in the early to mid 1970s, and she had established the foundation already. And then she left virtually all of her assets to the foundation in the early 1970s. So it was, she was making, the foundation existed and she was making contributions, but the assets really came in the early 1970s. And thanks to the leadership of a number of really far-sighted board members, one fellow named Jack Anderson in particular, they made really good investments, and chose to focus in an area that a lot of philanthropy was not then focused on, which is policy, public policy, and then gradually developed the foundation as it is now. And because of the, I think her original assets, the original assets were about $280 million, but because of very successful investment strategies and investing strategies, it's obviously grown a huge amount. And at the same time, we've given away a huge amount. So we're very well established at this point.
Well, I read an interview you gave in which you mentioned three key mentors at Joyce. And the first one was Craig Kennedy, who I'm not sure if he hired you, but he was the one who put you into kind of the arts and culture portfolio. Talk about Craig Kennedy and just sort of his role in your development at Joyce.
Yeah, Craig is just a brilliant man. And he also happens to have a very strong interest in baseball, particularly the White Sox. And my husband shares that passion. And the two of us, well, the three of us were at a baseball game. I was sitting between the two of them, and they're both leaning forward, watching the game and watching every pitch. And I'm like, I don't know what to do with my life. And I'm not sure I'm in the right job and blah, blah, blah. And finally, Craig said to me, I can't talk about this right now. Call me next week and we'll talk. So I did. And one thing led to another. And he offered me a position working in the arts portfolio, another random walk in my career, which started with complaints and then went to a really nice offer. And because I had the finance degree, Craig allowed me to shadow him on the investment side of things. So I mean, I had a finance degree, but I didn't really know that much about investing. And his generosity in allowing me to participate and learn, sort of, as I say, shadowing him, was just an incredible opportunity for me to develop a skill set that has, been really important both to me and to the foundation all these years later. So I'll say one other thing about Craig. He has which is a really frightening thing for someone that you work for. He has virtually perfect recall of everything he reads, and he hardly sleeps. So, but those two things made him a very challenging guy to work for, because there was no messing around. You had to be very careful remembering everything that you had said and written and that he had read. So, but he was a great mentor for me.
Well, and you had mentioned Mr. Anderson, Jack Anderson, who was the chairman of the board, I think, for nearly a quarter century. You describe him as someone who was a soft-spoken gentleman, but when he spoke, people leaned forward and listened. And you also said this, you said he had great judgment and allowed the foundation to take on a very high-risk tolerance in the issues and strategies we took on, as long as we had a clear sense of where we were going and what the potential for success was. Talk about that broadly, but also that concept, which I know comes up a lot in your work, about the tolerance for risk and how that maybe is unusual in philanthropy.
Yeah, well, I mean, you've just said what I would say about Jack. Is he extremely, extremely smart and really interested in making a difference, but also understanding and understood and helped us understand that not everything we tried would work. And so there was tolerance for things not working, as long as you were making, reasoned judgments about why they might work, and the right amount of investment to, if they had a chance, you were going to make it possible. And that sort of theory of operating has really continued, even though Jack hasn't been on the board for a couple of years. It sort of undergirds everything that we do, and it undergirds how I think about our responsibility and our opportunity as a philanthropy. So yes, Jack was soft-spoken isn't quite the right language. He just didn't speak often. But when he spoke, it was with certainty. And I will say, from a professional growth point of view, very early in my tenure, as president of the foundation, I called him with a piece of news that I was just not happy. I was very nervous about telling him. There was something that had gone on in the foundation. I was very nervous that it would reflect poorly on my management of the foundation. So I called him up after procrastinating for several days, and silence, which I'd gotten to expect. Silence. And he said, well, that's just the way it goes sometimes. Anything else? And it was that sort of gentle, experienced, great judgment that he had, and a steadiness that made it, he was a great guy to work for.
And so I guess undergirding it was just this sense of we have to think it through. We have to have, make clear, careful decisions. And hopefully a lot of things will work out, but some things won't. And try to learn from that and then move on, as opposed to just being kind of tied up in knots about failures.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. And also, calculated risk. So sometimes, putting things on the table that you're pretty sure aren't gonna work, but they're gonna cause people to think differently about a particular issue. That you'd see us doing some of that too. Okay. I was very influenced at one time by a political analyst who was looking at the environmental community and saying, on the spectrum of organizations, you've got sort of the Environmental Defense Fund, thoughtful, serious, works with government on one end, and you've got Rainforest Alliance, throwing paint on, whatever, taking over ships or whatever, and being very radical and very disruptive. And all of those organizations from on either end of the spectrum and those in between working together make for an effective environmental movement. And you could look at, grant making in the same way, that there's room for lots of different kinds of organizations and strategies, as long as they're coordinated in some way to move an issue forward. And that sometimes you need a Rainforest Alliance and sometimes you need an Environmental Defense Fund. Most of the times you need both.
Right. And talk about, I think as the current chair, Jose Alvarez, you mentioned Mr. Alvarez as also being an important force in your professional life.
So Jose, when he first came on the board, very experienced corporate guy, sits on a bunch of corporate boards, and at that time was a professor at Harvard, or he taught at Harvard Business School. He subsequently has moved to Dartmouth, just bouncing around the Ivy League, but very, very smart guy also. And Jose, because of his background and experience, he's from Chicago. He had, a lot of tough times growing up, grew up, without many resources, and sort of fortunately was identified by Princeton as a good candidate to be an undergrad. Anyway, Jose has sort of a passion for social justice, very strong passion for social justice, and also a very sophisticated view of what the role of the board should be in our organization. And so he has helped us kind of elevate the board's role as being largely strategic, not focused on, like micro issues or, trying to, they review every grant, but the focus of the conversation is what's the strategy and how are we moving toward achieving our strategy. So Jose just has this unique combination of that very, very strategic approach to philanthropy with a passion for making change. Mm-hmm. And so he's been a very effective chair. And again, mentor for me in that way. And I think he's really elevated the foundation in a very significant way during his term as chair.
Well, you mentioned strategy, and I know in 2018, Joyce came out with a strategic plan. It was revised slightly in 2021. But it was, I think you kind of intensified some of your approach. And I want to go through some of the kind of the broad areas and maybe have you discussed maybe some of the programs that are sort of maybe kind of Joyce at its best, taking risk, pulling together maybe unlikely coalitions, and just doing what it can to serve as the social capital of the region. And the first one is culture. I know that's one area that you're personally interested in, but talk about Joyce's work in that realm.
Well, yeah, I would say the culture work is actually the one thing we do that is not policy oriented. We really focus on artists of color. There's essentially two strands to our work. One is supporting organizations in Chicago that are led by people of color, serving people of color, or developing audiences, new audiences. And then the second strand is supporting individual artists through something called the Joyce Awards, which is providing direct grants to artists in partnership with organizations to produce new work. And I think we've done a good job of identifying really great up and coming artists who've gone on to win, MacArthur Genius Awards and Grammy Awards. And we've got two that won Pulitzer Prizes after we identified them. So we feel really great about supporting artists around the region who are contributing to the conversations about vital social issues. It's obviously a highly diverse group of artists, but it's not policy oriented. It really is just sort of acknowledging that the arts are part of the conversation and need to be part of the conversation about a whole wide range of issues, as well as being part of the economy.
Right.
So, yeah.
And when we talk about the region, maybe I kind of inferred, but it's Illinois, of course, it's Minnesota, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Indiana. Would that be
That's it.
Yeah.
You got it. Occasionally we stretch our, particularly in our gun program, we find that states like North Carolina and others, state of Washington, well, maybe they're a little Midwestern, but it's primarily focused on those Great Lakes states that you just mentioned.
Unlike football conferences, or the Big Ten is in California and Maryland, this is actually, when you say region, you mean region, right?
Yes, right. Exactly.
Let's talk about your democracy program. And as we talked offline, I'm familiar with some of the remarkable work Joyce did in the census of 2020. But I know you have other initiatives. So talk about what democracy programs you're most proud of.
Well, certainly our work on the census was important, and we like to talk about it because it's actually, you can see where our grantees leaned in and what the difference was in terms of there's undercounts everywhere, but reduced undercounts in the areas where our grantees worked really hard on the census. And obviously that's so important because it's about fair representation, and it's also about federal dollars coming into a state or region. So we feel good about investing in the census folks. We have had some, long time focus on fair maps, and miraculously, or maybe it wasn't a miracle, it was really good hard work in the state of Michigan. There was an independent citizens redistricting commission that established the requirement for map makers to have community input, and it dismantled the previous processes that allowed lawmakers to make their own maps, basically. So that's a huge victory that happened just, I guess, 2 years ago. So we'll see how that process then bears out over the next coming elections. What we are thinking a lot about right now, and again, it's under the direction of Carrie Davis, who I know you know from the board of Forefront, thinking a lot about safe elections, fair elections, effective elections. And there's a lot of concern about safety around elections. I mean, when you sort of have the overlap of open carry of guns and very few restrictions on guns. And, you can play out what that might look like. And there are a lot of concerns about among election officials about their own safety, and among the advocacy community about their safety. So there's all sorts of, everybody hears about and reads about, and perhaps unfortunately experiences the kind of threats that public officials or volunteers are experiencing these days. And so that's an issue that we're looking at, trying to work on going forward.
Education and environmental mobility. What programs there are you most focused on?
So yeah, it's education and economic mobility.
Okay.
And yeah, and so the focus there really is on completion. So K through 12, excellence in K through 12, and then completion 2 and 4 year degrees are a very high priority for us. We spent a lot of time in the past, and will continue in the future, looking at community colleges. Community colleges where most college students in America are located. Most college students in America go to community colleges, and yet there's a very wide dispersal in terms of outcomes, by which I mean completing a 2-year degree in 4 years. And focusing on that outcome as being so important to economic mobility. It's jobs, it's salary, it's family solidity. There's a whole lot of outcomes related to that are really critically important. So one of the things I'm really, really proud of is we established a prize called the Aspen Prize for Community College Excellence, which defines what excellence looks like as it pertains to completion rates for minority students, for all students, for students of color, and then also not just completion rates, but employment outcomes. And so it has established a standard for what excellence looks like. And of course, why do people pay attention? Because they want to win that $1 million prize, which comes out every 2 years. And it really, I was actually talking to the president of this small community college in Michigan last week, who said, I can't tell you, it's changed the game, because it's established these standards that we all are like, would I qualify? And could I possibly win? And if I qualify, how could I, or if I don't qualify, how can I get there? So we're very proud of our role in the community college system. I have to say there are many other funders. Lumina Foundation, for example, in Indianapolis is one of the leaders there as well. We have a lot of good partners on community college issues.
Okay, and I'm sorry, that's called the Aspen Prize. Is that right?
It's called the Aspen Prize for Community College Excellence.
Okay.
And it sits at the Aspen Institute. It's not just named after a tree. It sits at the Aspen Institute. And it's a very, very well run operation there. And it started basically from nothing. We got it rolling back in 2010, I think. Mm-hmm.
Good. Well, and the other one is environment. I conflated that with this. I know you're doing some really good work in terms of water issues, freshwater issues in the Great Lakes. Talk about that if you would.
So yeah, there are two things I'd like to emphasize there. One is Great Lakes water quality. And that's an issue we've been involved in for many, many years. Most specifically, there's something called the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which really got its legs in 2009 or so, 2009, when we started getting some serious federal money into a pot that is to be spent on maintaining and improving water quality in the Great Lakes. People love the Great Lakes. They love their lake. The closer they live to a lake, the more they love the lake. But in general, it's something from a political point of view, it polls incredibly, like Great Lakes water quality polls incredibly well. But there have been a lot of threats to the Great Lakes over the years. The Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, we did pretty well. We got $50 million and 150, we were getting some money and spending it well. But in the bipartisan infrastructure law, there's a $1 billion commitment to the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And specifically, it's meant to clean up the areas of so-called areas of concern, which is a technical term, but people are familiar with, these deeply, deeply polluted parts of the Great Lakes. There were 43 areas of concern, really seriously polluted parts of the Great Lakes in 1987. And they're basically toxic hotspots. So from 1987 to 2022, only 6 of the 43 areas of concern had been cleaned up. 6 is better than none, but it's not a lot. This massive new federal investment is going to ensure that 28 additional AOCs in our region will be cleaned up by the year of 2030. It's a huge thing. And it's, we're proud of our role in getting GLRI established, the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative established. If it hadn't been established and didn't have a track record, I don't think they would have gotten $1 billion for cleanup of these toxic hotspots. And when I say we, please don't misunderstand me. It's our grantees, it's the advocacy community. There are many other funders involved. So we're part of a team.
Right. Ellen, I know an issue that's really powerfully resonant with you is the issue of gun violence and prevention. And I know Joyce has been really active in that, I think since the 90s. I think you're actively working with the Attorney General. Talk about the problem and what progress are we making in dealing with it?
Yeah, well, I think everybody's aware of the problem. I mean, there are more guns than people in the United States. There are 45,000 deaths a year related to guns and gun violence. 2/3 of those are suicides, which a lot of people don't know. But there are, too many tragic deaths of young children who find the gun and play with the gun and shoot the gun. Obviously, our communities, particularly in urban areas, are just plagued by, mass shootings all the time that don't get the attention of some of the more high-profile mass shootings. You have situations like Uvalde that are just sort of appall the conscience. It's hard to get your brain around the tragedy of those children's lives and their families' lives, and the massive impact of these huge, horrible events that, by the way, do not occur in other countries. I mean, we do not have a more violent society than any other developed nation. There's a ton of evidence on this. What we have is more guns and easy access to guns, and that's the difference. And figuring out solutions to that is very, very difficult. In large part, we've got these powerful advocates and lobbyists, and the gun industry itself is extremely powerful. And they, the NRA and the gun manufacturing lobby, they have a lot of interest in keeping things the way they are. So, we've been working against that. I don't want to say good news, but there are areas of progress. And one is the bipartisan Safer Communities Act that passed a couple months ago in Congress. It's the first and largest package of gun bills in a really, really long time. Many folks in our world feel like it didn't go far enough, but I'm choosing to look at the positive aspect of the fact that something went through. I'm sorry it took Uvalde to wake up Congress, but after Uvalde, that bill was quickly put together and it was bipartisan and it was signed by the President of the United States. The thing that I note on that is that a lot of the aspects of that bill, the reason things like extreme risk protection orders, most people know them as red flag orders, things like that are in the bill is because philanthropy, private philanthropy, paid for the research to document what the impact would be of different kinds of policies. And so folks working on the bill had something to hang on to. They had evidence. The evidence was almost entirely paid for by private philanthropy, our foundation and others, trying to determine, okay, what aspects, what kinds of policies would effectively reduce access to guns and the likelihood of somebody taking one to shoot themselves or shoot others. So red flag laws, something that I feel good about that. We've also funded a lot of public opinion work. And I know there are dueling public opinion polls, but I think, consistently we've done all kinds of polling that shows that the huge majorities of Americans support common sense gun laws. And that's also something that our elected officials can hang their hat on when they're thinking about whether to move forward or not. So, the impact of the Supreme Court's ruling recently on guns, we'll see how that pans out. But it's an ever-changing, and very difficult field to work in. And it's something that I personally feel really passionate about and feel very grateful to our board for sticking with it for 25 years. We've also started to work more on criminal justice issues writ large, and also on community violence intervention, which is a growing field. And in fact, last week, the Department of Justice hosted a couple hundred people from around the country who are doing street level violence interruption work, to learn from each other, to meet each other, to build a network, to learn from each other, and to get access to Department of Justice funds. So we were very, very happy to be part of that conversation, and just thrilled that Attorney General Merrick Garland came. He did a several-hour-long site visit to a community violence intervention organization in East St. Louis, and he gave a great talk to the group, which made people feel like, the work that we're doing here really matters. So it was a great meeting.
Well, another area you talk about changing fields. I mean, journalism. I know it's another area that you're trying to do important work and trying to kind of reestablish the ethos of fact-based, objectivity, fairness. Talk about your work in journalism.
Yeah. So a couple of years ago, I was thinking about how much money are we spending on journalism projects throughout all our programs? Each program would be funding this or that journalism program. And I realized if you added it all up, it really was turning into an actual program. And our focus is on, we are supporting smaller community-based, community voice journalism programs around the Great Lakes states, making sure that people's voices are being heard, that they have a platform, and that they're basically well represented. We are also obviously encouraging fact-based reporting and objective reporting on key issues that are important to us, important to others as well. And in addition, we are interested in new models of journalism. So, for example, in Chicago, and I know in other areas of the country, there have been different experiments with nonprofit journalism. The one in Chicago that is really interesting is the public radio station, WBEZ, and a scrappy, long-time print paper, the Chicago Sun-Times, have merged and become a nonprofit organization. And so the idea is that the print journalism and the broadcast journalism support and enhance each other. And in the nonprofit model, instead of subscribing, you become a contributor. And so that's a very interesting experiment that has captured the attention of folks around the country, because it's a little bit of a new model. Philanthropy played a big role. MacArthur Foundation and the Knight Foundation, Joyce Foundation, Pritzker Traubert Foundation, a number of foundations, both local and national, pooled together about $60 million to support the launch of this thing. And we'll see how it goes. It may be one of our high risk, high success models. I'm hoping it is.
We'll keep an eye on that. Well, Ellen, you, and I think it was in late October, maybe mid-October, you spoke at the City Club of Chicago. I think it was your 13th or so appearance. You're maybe spoke there more than any other public official. And your talk was really striking in the sense that it was, I mean, very balanced, focused on some of the positive trends that are happening, some of the positive developments. But you also had some areas of real concern. You spoke really powerfully about, gun violence and political polarization. But the thing that struck me most, you were talking about, and maybe it was some polling you did or some research you did on just the attitude of younger people, and came across really troubling signs of both anger and fear that seems to have kind of permeated, maybe even enveloped this younger generation. And it's likely to have really profound effects on public policy and life in Illinois and the United States. Talk about that. I mean, what is it that has happened to this generation, and what can be done, either with, the Joyce or the Simon Institute or others to start addressing this issue?
Yeah. Well, I think I was talking about a particular poll that we had sponsored that had the thing that was really alarming was that it was the people that you thought would be most likely to be aligned with, let me generally say, sort of progressive policy issues and so on, were actually the opposite. Younger people were more alienated than older people. Younger people were felt more disenfranchised. There were just many negative trends among people under the age of 30, particularly on gun issues, but on other issues as well. And I was trying to think about that relative to what we were seeing. Sort of a radicalization in a negative way on the part of many young people. I was actually preparing for this conversation. I was thinking, in addition, everybody's read, and I'm not an expert on this topic, but everybody has read about mental health problems among our youth and depression issues. And the impact of the COVID isolation era on young people. And I think there's a generational impact that we should not ignore. It's not just going to go away. I mean, there are educational impacts. We've lost, years of education for people at certain critical moments. We've lost years of socialization for certain young people at during critical times. And we have this sort of growing sense of cynicism and lack of trust in institutions, and that it just seems like a very concerning trend. And so that is what I was talking about. I was anchoring it on this one poll, but it resonated with a lot of people. Perhaps they had their own young people at home or their own experiences, but a lot of people really responded to that. To answer your question, what can we do about it? I think we have to figure out ways to rebuild trust in our institutions, because if you don't believe in democracy, if you don't believe in institutions in general, then how do you proceed, in in the path that we would hope all young people would, in terms of building financial security and family security and security for their children, and engagement in the institutions that keep our country going.
And we've had a couple of terrific questions emailed in. One is from a person who wants to know how they can sort of assess various groups in philanthropy as they're figuring about who they want to donate to. Is there any kind of rating agency? The question is, how can we check the ratings of philanthropic groups in order to know that most of our donation is addressing the issue that we want it to?
Yeah, there are some philanthropic rating agencies, and they're mostly focused, I think, on basic sort of administrative and financial regulatory stuff. So people can Google that and figure that out. But I do think that if you're making contributions that are meaningful to you, doesn't need to be millions of dollars, but if it's meaningful to you, you should really, I don't know who I'm addressing, but one should make the effort to talk to a human being and try to develop a relationship with the organization. One can't always, and we certainly have had this happen to us, if there's fraud going on or, some bad apple at an organization, even we, with all our due diligence, sometimes that happens. I think it's more about the people that you're investing in and believing in that, their passion and their effectiveness in their goals. So it's personal relationships to the extent that you can develop them.
Right. Another question applauds your work and the Joyce Foundation and wants to know if the Joyce Foundation is active in micropolitan cities and towns. What are some of their projects and priorities in this realm? You might even define that term. I'm assuming that's communities of 5,000 or less. I don't know what is actually the definition of that.
What is the word even?
Micropolitans.
That's a great word. I've never heard that before. So that's a very, very relevant question, because I think what underlies that question is, are you focusing mostly on urban populations and urban issues, or are you considering rural populations and rural issues? That's a very live question for us, because it's very true that if you look at most of what we do, it is very much focused in urban areas. That's where most of the people are. But there's a lot of people who live especially in our region, in downstate Illinois, as you know, and in Ohio and Wisconsin. And we're trying to figure out how we can be more engaged and more effective at addressing issues in rural areas, without losing the focus on, what our core goals are. So, for example, there's a lot we could do with community colleges. There's on guns, suicide, as I mentioned, is a huge and growing problem. And that affects rural populations more than it does urban populations statistically. So there's a lot of things that we could and should be doing. So whoever asked that question, that was an excellent, very relevant one for us. It's very live.
Okay. Well, Ellen, I saw in an interview you were asked an influential book, and you mentioned The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson, which came out, I think, 2010. I remember actually I read it when it came out. And after I read your interview, I went back through the book and was kind of looking through it. And I want to read a sentence or two and just maybe have you respond broadly to it. And it's one of the just unforgettable characters is a woman by the name of Ida May, who comes from Mississippi, and then she goes to Chicago, Milwaukee. I think she ends up in Chicago. Really hugely compelling person. But this is the description of her. It says, the great belching city she passed through that day was the first city Ida May had ever laid her eyes on. The first glimpse of Chicago would stay with her as long as she lived. She says, what did it look like at that time, Chicago? I asked her a half light later. It looked like heaven to me then, she said. Tell us about, I guess just sort of the magic of places like, Chicago, Milwaukee, some of these other, vibrant communities that are in the region that you're trying to to promote and spur and help?
I responded to that line so much. That it's so funny that you picked that. So let me just say, I'm a real outdoor person. I'm a hiker. I was on the board of the National Park Foundation for 10 years, 9 years, something. I wish it was longer. I'm very much an outdoor. I love being outdoors. I love being in a city. But Ida May, as I recall, also loved and talked about how hard it was to transfer from her beautiful southern peaceful life where she could see the sunshine, and she gets to Chicago and she cannot see this, like, I don't see the sunshine and I'm crowded and there's no trees around. And I remember that vividly in the book. What a great book. I've become an urbanist. I've become an urban person. I love cities. I love the interconnectedness of people. I love the way that we can walk everywhere, and if we're in a healthy, safe environment, we can interact with one another in a way that just doesn't happen outside of a dense urban environment. So I love living in a city. I can't imagine not living in a city. But I also deeply respect and understand why people also want to live somewhere where when the sun comes down, sun is there, it's shining right in their front yard, and they don't want people around all the time. And I have a brother who lives in Maine who, he comes to visit in Chicago, and he's just like, that's so much traffic. I'm like, doesn't seem like traffic to me. You should try New York. So, yeah, that's funny that you picked out Ida May, because her story really was compelling to me as well.
Yeah. Well, Ellen, final question, and I like to ask this of our guests is, we have a fair number of students on this call, and what kind of advice would you give them as they start thinking about their careers and how to organize their lives? I mean, what are the things now that you wish you would have known when you were walking out of Brown or, finishing up at Kellogg? What have you learned?
That's a lot of questions packed into one question. But one thing that I really object to is when people say, follow your passion, follow your passion. Like, first of all, not every 21-year-old knows what their passion is. It's a very confusing thing to say to somebody unless they happen to, know exactly. You don't know exactly what you want to do. You don't know exactly what's going to bring that sense of completion and satisfaction to you until you try some things. So my advice is try some things. Don't be paralyzed by what's my passion or it has to be perfect or whatever. Try some stuff. And I think you eventually figure out the things that make sense. That's how it worked for me. I went into a corporate environment. I was like, whoa, I'm not cut out for this. Another person might go into a corporate environment and love the structure and love the hierarchy and love the, and operate really well there. It depends on how you react to an environment. So, that's my advice. And things I've learned that, life is a random walk, and you can't predict exactly what the next opportunity is going to be or what's coming, what's coming your way. And you have to accept that to some extent.
Great. Well, and finally, I mean, for people who want to follow the work of Joyce, what is the best way they can do that? I know you have a terrific website, social media. How can people follow your work?
I would highly suggest signing up on our website for the particular areas that might be of interest to you. And we do occasional outreach. If you're interested in gun violence or community violence interventions or criminal justice reform, our team has done a series of really, really excellent webinars that are fairly frequent, actually. And you can reach out to Sabrina or me or whatever, and we can get you signed up for those. And those are well attended. Several hundred people hundreds of people on each of those. And then there are a couple people on the staff that you might want to follow on Twitter, not including myself, because I never post. I don't tweet. But Stephanie Banchero, who runs our education and economic mobility program, tweets about education issues, and she'd be a good one to start with. Okay. I would recommend following her.
Great. Well, Ellen, thank you so much for really a wide-ranging and interesting discussion. As I said offline, I mean, I've heard so many good things about Joyce. I've worked with a couple of your colleagues who are just amazingly impressive, and as I say, I've heard great things about Joyce and the important work you're doing. So I know I look forward to continuing to follow you, and maybe we can coax you down to Carbondale sometime and speak to a class and meet people in community and just see. I think we're technically in the Great Lakes region. We're ways down from Chicago, but it would be great to host you here at some point.
Thank you, and thank you for doing this. It's just great to have an opportunity to chat, and I know you've got a big audience, and I'm honored to be here.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
All righty.
And thanks to all you for watching another edition of our series, Understanding Our New World. We'll have this video on our website in the coming days. Please look at it, show it to family and friends. Follow us on social media. We're on all platforms. Thanks for supporting the Institute and keeping the memory of Paul Simon alive and well. Thank you so much.